Some places in the world are thin. There are some places where the veil between what we know and what we fear wears away to almost nothing. The rolling hills of southeastern Oklahoma are full of such places, reportedly. In the Sans Bois Mountains, a name that translates literally to without woods, the trees stand like silent witnesses, and the rocky soil holds secrets that it does not give up easily. And in the autumn of 2009, in the heart of these mountains, a silence took root, a silence that swallowed an entire family whole, leaving behind a story so tangled, so steeped in paranormal and paranoia. It feels sometimes less like a true crime case and more like a ghost story that whispered around a dying fire. This is the story of the Jamison family, a father, a mother, and their 6-year-old daughter who drove up a lonely mountain road in search of what? We don't know, and found an ending that defies all explanation, even to this day. An ending that begins with kind of a chilling image from a grainy security footage camera capturing the family moving as what people describe as ghost-like or robotic in the final hours of their lives. And so we need to talk about the Jamison family. Let's unravel. Hello, Unravelers. Welcome back. If you're new here, then welcome. I'm Tiff, and this is Tiff Unraveled. So our story here begins not in those mountains, but on the shores, and I hope I'm saying this right, of Lake Eufaula in Oklahoma. And here lived the Jamison family. We have 40-year-old Bobby Dale, his 40-year-old wife, Sherilynn Leanne, and their daughter, the center of their universe, 6-year-old Madyson Stormy Star Jamison. To the outside world, these were two doting parents. It was a very tight-knit family unit whose love for their daughter, by all reports, was absolute. But inside their home, it seemed that maybe a storm was gathering. The walls of the house were closing in, and some say by forces seen, and some say by those unseen. Bobby Jamison was a man living in the shadow of a single violent moment. A car crash in 2003 had left him with a back injury so severe and so debilitating that he was in constant grinding pain. He couldn't work. He lived on disability. He was a man trapped, not just in his own home, but in his own body. The physical prison that he was living in cast a very long shadow over absolutely everything. It is a critical detail. It's a piece of the puzzle that just, somehow refuses to fit, as many of the pieces in this story do. But remember this man crippled by pain when we start to picture the last terrain that he would ever be seen. Sherilynn was fighting her own battles. These were ones that raged within her mind. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she had apparently a tempest of moods that can pull her from soaring highs to crushing lows. Friends and family were often very worried about Sherilynn. She many times reportedly would not take her medication, and that kind of just left her untethered in a way and very vulnerable to these crushing currents of her own mind. And recently, a new grief had settled over Sherilynn. Her sister had died. And this just added another layer of sorrow to a life that was already very heavy with struggle. Together, they were a family essentially under siege, right? This was two parents on disability, facing constant financial strain. They seemed to be pulling away from the world, a retreat that by most accounts was just becoming more and more extreme. They had a plan, a desperate final gambit to escape. They wanted to buy a 40-acre plot of land deep in the red oak area of the Sans Bois Mountains. And there, that's where they would live, not in a house, but in a large steel shipping container, the very one that actually sat in their front yard, like a monument to their isolation at the time. They told people that they wanted to, quote, get away, unquote, to live off grid. But this was more than a desire for a simpler life. A lot of people think it was a very profound and unsettling withdrawal from society as a whole. They pulled Madyson out of school, severing one of their last connections to the outside world, and they were turning inward, and it was creating a loop, an echo chamber where their shared anxieties could begin to grow unchecked and unchallenged. And it was in this pressure cooker of pain, of mental illness, and of isolation that the first truly bizarre cracks began to appear. The Jamisons actually became convinced that they were not alone in their home. They told their pastor, his name was Gary Brandon, that their home was haunted. They weren't just seeing things in the shadows. This was a direct confrontation, according to Sherilynn and Bobby. They claimed that 2 of 4 ghosts were living on their roof, and they were, in their own words, engaged in, quote, spiritual warfare. Their 6-year-old daughter, Madyson, began talking to a new friend, an imaginary friend perhaps, but to the Jamisons, she was terrifyingly real, a little girl named Emily, who they said was the spirit of a child who had died in the home long, long ago. Sherilynn, however, grew to believe that Emily was not actually a child and that she was a demon, a malevolent entity that had latched itself onto their only daughter. So this fear, of course, under these kinds of circumstances, this fear becomes an obsession, and it demanded action, right? Bobby, he's this man broken by a car accident. He went to his pastor with a very strange and chilling request. He needed to know where he could buy, quote, special bullets, unquote. Bullets, he explained, to shoot the spirits that were plaguing his family. Sherilynn's approach was a little bit different. She sought knowledge from a much darker place. She bought a copy of the Satanic Bible. Bobby later admitted to reading it, telling his pastor that he was trying to understand his enemy, to learn how to perform an exorcism in his own home. And this spiritual battle, in their eyes, this was all-consuming. Sherilynn would leave notes scrawled all around the house, desperate commands like, get out, Satan. And on the side of that steel shipping container in their yard, she spray painted a cryptic, grammatically strange warning. It said, quote, 3 cats killed to date by people in this area. Witches don't like their black cat killed, unquote. The lines were blurring here. The war against spirits was becoming indistinguishable from a war against the world. And then, it came to a point that they believed that they had physical enemies in the world, in the physical world, right? Not just spiritual, but in our physical world. And the most dangerous one to them of all was Bobby's own father. His name was Bob Dean Jamison. The relationship reportedly was pretty toxic. It was poisoned by a very bitter lawsuit over money. But the fear for the Jamisons was so intense, apparently, that less than 6 months before they vanished, Bobby filed for a protective order against his own father. In the court filing, he made a pretty terrifying claim. He said that his father had planned to kill him, threatened to kill him, kill Sherilynn and their little 6-year-old Madyson on 2 separate occasions. Apparently this happened, according to the protective order that was filed. He claimed that his father had even once struck him with his car. So the petition, right, and again, this is all from the perspective of the filer. The petition describes Bob Dean as a, quote, very dangerous man who thinks that he is above the law, unquote. A man involved with, quote, prostitutes, gangs, and meth. I can't probably say any of those things on YouTube, can I? Well, I guess we'll find out today. The family installed security cameras all around their home, not for ghosts, not these cameras. They were not for ghosts. They were for the flesh and blood monster that they believed was coming for them. So I'm going to insert the footage that we have of the Jamison family before they left their home. This was really essentially like the last time that this family was seen. And this is the footage that everybody talks about in regards to this case. So let's just take a look at that together, shall we? One moment. Okay, so the screen that I'm sharing with you now, this is from a Facebook page. From the poster is Straight Up Enigmas podcast. Shout out to you. This is one of the only uncut ones that I could find. And yeah, let's go through this together. And that's it. That's what we have. I guess. Okay, well, I'll save my little baby opinion for just a moment from now. Okay, but this CCTV footage is taken from one of the security cameras on their property on the morning of October 8th, 2009. Okay, this was the day that they disappeared. The very cameras that they installed to protect themselves would instead record this family's final moments at their home. And the footage is grainy, it's time-lapsed. For 20 minutes, and only some of it has been released. This is what we saw, is the little snippet that we have. But for 20 minutes, apparently, this footage shows Bobby and Sherilynn like packing up their trucks. Now, everyone that talks about, not everyone, when all of this, came out, everyone was really creeped out by this CCTV footage. Everybody was like, look how slow and methodically they're moving. It's almost like it's trance-like, it's ghost-like. They're making dozens of trips from the house to the truck, but they never speak to each other. They never look at each other. They move past one another like strangers, right? Their faces are blank. Their bodies are like on autopilot. Even investigators later on would go on to describe their movements as trance-like and robotic, like claiming that it seemed as if they were in a daze or under the influence of something. Listen, this interpretation, here's where I'm going to insert my little 2 cents, not that anybody asked for it, but I get that this interpretation is central to this case's mythology, right? It, to me, however, is so far from anything definitive. The footage is of extremely poor quality. It is so time-lapsed. It's like one of those older cameras, right? Before we had all our digital ring stuff that captures every frame, every second. It's one of those like older cameras that only captures like one frame every like 3 or 4 seconds. So there's so much missing in between each robotic movement. Of course it's going to look robotic. You're capturing like one frame every 4 or 5 seconds. Okay. It's not going to look smooth. It's not going to look natural. In my opinion, I'm no expert by any means, right? But it's, in my opinion, using this footage, I feel like it would be really difficult to accurately gauge their mannerisms in any way. To a skeptical eye, right, this isn't a portrait of a family in a trance. It's maybe simply just two people who are exhausted. They're stressed. Maybe they're not speaking. Maybe they are. Maybe it's in those like, hey, honey, grab the suitcase or something in those frames, those lapses of frames that, are missing from each transition. And maybe they are methodically moving. They're packing, they're focused, they have their reasons, and they're ready to get out of there. They were on a mission. I think, and again, this is only my opinion, but I feel like maybe one of the reasons that this footage is so haunting and maybe slightly sinister is because, like, we know what happened to them after this. And so we're kind of watching this footage through the lens of their disappearance, if that makes sense. But again, just my opinion. All right. So moving on, during all of this, the camera captures one detail, however, at the end, and it shows Sherilynn walking to the truck and placing a brown briefcase inside. They get in the truck, Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson, and they drive away from the house near the lake, away from all of the ghosts on the roof and all of the enemies at the door, and they drive towards the Sans Bois mountains, towards that 40-acre plot of land that promised them what they were hoping was a new beginning. The Jamison family was never seen alive again. So for 8 days, there was silence. The Jamisons, they were private people. It wasn't unusual for them to be out of touch. No one reported them missing in that time. It was as if the world had not yet noticed that a hole had been torn in it. Then, on October 16th, a group of hunters on four-wheelers were cutting a path through the remote wilderness of Latimer County. They were near the top of a mountain on a desolate dirt road when they saw it. They saw a clean white pickup truck parked and silent, and it was locked. When the Latimer County Sheriff's Office arrived to this scene, it was eerily calm. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no broken glass. There was no blood. The truck was in perfect working order, plenty of gas in the tank. It was simply abandoned. It was abandoned there. So the sheriffs were forced to break a window on the truck to get inside. And from there, the deputies were just confronted with a tableau of clues that were so baffling to them and so contradictory. And these things still go on to haunt this case, even to this day. Inside the truck, they found the family's wallets, their IDs, their credit cards. Both Bobby's and Sherilynn's cell phones were inside the truck, along with a GPS unit and Sherilynn's purse. Their coats were folded up neatly inside. It was as if they had just stepped out of the vehicle for a moment, intending to return. But then there was the money. Hidden under the driver's seat, tucked away in a bank bag, was a staggering amount of cash, $32,000. For a family living off of 2 disability incomes, a family struggling, as reported, with financial problems, I mean, this seemed like an impossible sum of money. Like, where did this come from? Was there like a lawsuit settlement? Or was it something else? Was it something illicit that had drawn them to this lonely place? And then the deputies found the sole survivor in this case. They found, curled up in the cab of the truck, the family dog, Maisie. She was alive, but just barely. She was emaciated. She was dehydrated. She had been locked in this truck for, as far as they knew, 8 days, slowly starving to death. The Jamisons, who doted on their daughter, also doted on their dog. They loved Maisie, and they had left her in the cab of this vehicle, and she was, she was going to die in like the most agonizing way imaginable, like dehydration, starvation, heat. It was an act that a lot of people found so cruel that it seemed to scream against the theory of a voluntary departure here. People that knew them were like, they would never leave Maisie behind like that. Something had to have happened, something sudden, something violent that prevented them from coming back for Maisie. And then there was one more thing. There was one more thing that offered a glimpse into the storm that was raging inside of this family at this time. It was an 11-page letter written by Sherilynn to her husband, Bobby. This was no love letter. This was no love letter. Investigators described it as being full of hate. In this letter, she raged against her husband. She called him a recluse, a hermit who didn't care about his family. It was a portrait of a marriage that was kind of at a breaking point. What was found in the truck in general was just a complete paradox, right? The cash, the phones, the IDs, the money, all of this left behind. So this again argues against this planned escape, and it definitely argues that they were like maybe held at gunpoint or robbed while they were on there, because all this stuff was there. But there were some things missing. That brown briefcase that Sherilynn was seen placing in the truck on that grainy video, that was gone. And more importantly, Sherilynn's handgun. It was a small .22 caliber pistol that she almost always kept with her for protection. That was also missing. Now, the truck was locked, like we said, and very specific items were taken. And so that suggests purpose, right? It suggests a plan. So how can both of these things be true? Using the GPS that they found inside the truck and using the cell phone data, investigators did start to piece together the family's last known movements. The data showed that they drove to this spot, like straight to this spot, got out of their truck and walked up a nearby hill to Rocky Bluff. And it was there on that bluff that Bobby took the last known photograph of his sweet daughter, Madyson. The image was recovered from his phone, and it is heartbreaking in its ambiguity. 6-year-old Madyson stands there alone. Her arms are crossed, and her expression is kind of unreadable. Like, is she angry? Is she frightened or scared? Or is she just a really tired little girl who doesn't want to have her picture taken? Like, we don't know. But like everything else in this case, the photo is just another glimpse into this, like this mirror. We see in it what we want to see in it, and it's usually what we fear the most. After the photo was taken, the data shows that the family went back down the hill, back towards their truck, and then nothing. The trail goes cold right there. Just feet from their vehicle, the Jamison family stepped out of the world and stepped into the silence of these mountains. The search that followed their disappearance, and followed finding their vehicle, it was massive, massive. Hundreds of volunteers, police, fire departments, all of these people were combing this very, very rugged terrain. They searched on foot. They searched on horseback. They used helicopters. They used scent dogs. They drained a nearby water tank. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a shred of clothing, not a single sign of this family. They had just disappeared. The mountains had swallowed them whole. And for 4 years, that is where that story went cold. That's where it ended. For 4 years. Can you imagine being the loved one of this family, being a close friend or a neighbor or a family member, and not having any answers for 4 years? I mean, a whole family vanished, right? There's this truck that's just full of these, in my opinion, baffling clues. It's just a mix. It's just a mystery that cooled into a local legend, a ghost story told in the shadows of the Sans Bois Mountains. The case was featured on the TV show, I think, Investigation Discovery, called Disappeared, and it brought national attention to the case, but it brought no answers. Hope, what little remained, began to fade. Then, on November 16th, 2013, that silence was broken. A group of deer hunters were pushing through this remote, almost impassable part of Latimer County. It was a place that people rarely went to. It was steep, wooded hollow, less than 3 miles from where the Jamisons' truck had been found 4 years prior. And there, scattered among the dead leaves and the rocks, they found them. The partial skeletal remains of 2 adults and 1 child. The wilderness had taken its toll. Obviously, 4 years of sun, of rain, of animal activity. It had left little more than bone. But investigators could tell one thing. They could tell that the three of them had died together in the same place. Some who were at the scene would actually later claim that the bodies were found laying side by side, face down in the dirt as if they had been executed. A neat, terrible row of three. The location in itself was another riddle. A riddle. Less than 3 miles as the crow flies. But the walk from that truck to that spot would have been grueling. Grueling. A very treacherous journey over very steep inclines and into very dense forests. How did Bobby Jamison, remember we talked about how riddled he was with pain, he was a prisoner inside the pain of his own body. How did Bobby Jamison make that journey? How did he do that? How did a 6-year-old girl, for that matter? And they couldn't have just wandered off and gotten lost, right? This was a journey that a lot of people claim was made under extreme duress. Like they were pushing through because they had to push through. This is not some place that you just kind of, you lose your sense of direction, you wander off. Okay. So what was happening? Were they fleeing from something terrifying, or were they being marched to that very spot where they would lose their lives? It took over 7 months of, forensic testing, of matching DNA and dental records for the official word to come down. But it did. On July 3rd, 2014, the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office confirmed what I think everyone had already known in their hearts. The remains that were found belonged to Bobby, Sherilynn, and Madyson Jamison. The search was finally over, and there was a little bit of closure there. They were able to be brought home, but the mystery really only deepened from there. The final autopsy report offered absolutely no answers. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, the forensic pathologists could not even come close to determining a cause of death for any of these three. The official finding for all three was listed as undetermined. There were no obvious knife marks on the bones, no fractures from a heavy blow. And this forensic shrug just kind of left every possibility on the table. Still, was it poison? Was it suffocation? Was it exposure to the elements? But there was one final tantalizing clue, a mark that could be everything or it could be nothing at all. While examining Bobby Jamison's skull, the coroner found a small circular hole in the back of his cranium. It was consistent with a small caliber gunshot wound, perhaps from a .22 pistol. Sherilynn's missing .22 pistol, maybe. Suddenly, all of these pieces start to click into place. Could this have been a taking and self-unaliving? But the medical examiner there was absolutely no way for the medical examiner to be sure. After 4 really long years in the wild, that hole could have been caused by absolutely anything. It could have been caused by the tooth of an animal, a scavenger. It could have been postmortem decay. And so, unfortunately, the autopsy report remained inconclusive. And so the case was left suspended. A family of 3 found dead side by side on a lonely mountain with a hole in the father's skull that may or may not be a bullet hole, and an official cause of death that was simply a question mark. When the world is left with no clear answers, what are we left with? Well, I'm sure you already know, but I'll tell you. Speculation and theories. And in the Jamison case, the theories here are a total labyrinth. Every path you take leads you to a dead end or some sort of contradiction that makes you turn back and start to question again everything that you thought that you knew about this case. So let's walk down a few of these paths together. On the evidence board here, the evidence board, we have the 11-page letter, we have the photo of the skull, and then we have the missing gun. And all of these are glowing in bright magenta. Okay. First, there is the theory of a family implosion, so to speak. which is where, as we touched on, we have someone taking the lives of their family members and then taking the lives of themselves. The evidence here is all psychological. It's all circumstantial. We have Sherilynn's reportedly mostly untreated bipolar disorder. We have the crushing weight of what they were going through in their lives, whether it was, whether what any of us think was actually going on, it doesn't matter, because to them it was happening. It was happening to them, and it was very real. It was very real. And the weight of it was crushing them. It was crushing them so much so that they were ready to just pack up absolutely everything and leave their lives to live off grid and away from the rest of the entire world. We have that 11-page letter, right, which is just dripping with anger and with despair. So did Sherilynn, in a very final and desperate act, lead her family 3 miles into the woods, shoot her husband in the back of his head, take the life of her own daughter, and then ultimately take her own life as a final act? The hole in the back of Bobby's skull and the missing gun, for a lot of people, seem to point that way. But this theory, in my opinion, kind of crumbles under its own weight, right? Why walk 3 miles into that terrain? Why not just do it at the truck? And then the gun, where was the gun? Where's the gun? It was never found. It was not found near the bodies. It was not found in the area. It was never found, period. And so it's hard to imagine in my brain. And again, I'm no expert in guns or animals, but it seems a little hard to imagine like an animal picking up a gun and carrying it off, or for it to just remain hidden for all of these years. And then there's the question of Maisie, right? The dog who they loved, just kind of left in the cab of this truck to either overheat, dehydrate, or starve, or a combination of all of the above. Incredibly cruel act, if that is true. And there's this unmistakable belief by absolutely everyone who knew this family that they would never, ever, ever harm Madyson, their daughter, ever. And so even investigators do not favor this theory. So then we turn down another path. This is a theory that is, netizens very popularly speculate upon. Was this something like a drug deal gone wrong? This theory is built on a foundation of the $32,000 cash that was found in their vehicle. Rural Oklahoma, oh, I did good. I'm not going to try it again. That part of Oklahoma is unfortunately very well known for Beth activity. Okay. The family's paranoia, the dramatic weight loss that people were reporting, and then all of the delusions that they were having, all of these are classic signs of Beth use. Did they drive up to that mountain to buy or sell? And then like that deal turned violent and ultimately deadly. But then this path leads to another big contradiction. If they were killed for drugs, why was the money, right, the entire point of the whole transaction, why was that left behind then? It makes no sense. People who take people's lives for money or for drugs take the money, right? And then why would they bring their 6-year-old daughter to a Beth deal in the middle of nowhere? Despite all of the rampant speculation as far as this theory is concerned, searches of their home and of their truck find absolutely no evidence of drugs anywhere. No pipes, no paraphernalia of any kind. None. That we've been told about anyway. I'm sure there's facts in this case that investigators have not released because it is still an unsolved case. So do we know everything? Absolutely not. I would never go so far as to say that. But as far as we know, as far as what's been reported, there was no sign of anything like that in the truck or in the home. And so this leads us to the darkest path: murder. Foul play by either a known or unknown party. And perhaps they weren't part of this criminal world, but simply stumbled into it while they were out there. Did they see something? Did they see a Beth lab hidden in the woods, and then they were silenced as witnesses? This would explain the suddenness, the panic, the reason that they couldn't return for Maisie. It fits the narrative also of them kind of being marched and ushered. This treacherous 3 miles to their deaths. But again, we come back to the money, right? So a killer or an entrepreneur of that type that would stumble upon a family with $32,000 in cash in their car does not leave it behind. Unless the motive wasn't robbery. What about like revenge? Remember Bobby's father, the man who allegedly threatened to kill them all? He had a motive, but he also had an ironclad alibi. At the time of their disappearance, he was actually in extremely poor health, and he was confined at either a hospital or a rest home, like a nursing home. I wasn't able to get like a solid detail, but he wasn't around. And then he actually died just 2 months later. Could he have hired someone? I've seen that being speculated. Sure, it's possible, but there's never been any evidence of that to surface. What about other whispers? There was apparently a boarder in their home that had some white supremacist ties that Sherilynn actually threw out of their house at gunpoint. And I believe he was actually questioned and cleared of this. And then I guess Sherilynn's mother had feared that they had joined some religious cult based on their behavior prior to their disappearance. But again, no proof of that has ever been found. Every path leads to a wall, and just not enough evidence. There's just not enough evidence of anything. There's not enough evidence of anything. There is one final theory, the simplest and perhaps the most easily dismissed. They had simply gotten lost. They went for a walk in the woods. The terrain confused them, and they succumbed to the elements. The undetermined cause of death does fit this, but nothing else does. Okay, so the weather in October in this area is pretty mild. Bobby's back would have made a hike that long incredibly agonizing, if not impossible. And no rational person leaves their coats, their phones, and their GPS and their beloved dog in a locked car to go on a casual stroll through a very dangerous and very unfamiliar wilderness. And so perhaps the answer is not in a single theory here. Perhaps the answer isn't how they died, but why they were there in the first place. The key may actually lie in the absolute psychological storm that had been consuming this family. So there is a rare psychiatric syndrome that is known as folie à deux, okay, or madness of two. It's a shared psychiatric disorder. It happens when one delusional belief is transmitted from a single person to others that are in a close, isolated relationship. So the Jamisons, in my opinion, were just the textbook definition of a family at risk. They were isolated. They were under extreme stress. They had a lot of pre-existing physical and mental illnesses. Their shared specific delusion, right, that they were under attack by demons and in this state of spiritual warfare, it fits that clinical picture perfectly. This shared psychosis, however, does not explain the hole in Bobby's skull. It doesn't explain the missing gun, but it does kind of provide some context for everything else that was going on. It explains if you believe the CCTV footage analysis, it explains that trance-like state that maybe they could have been in on that video. It explains why they would flee their home very suddenly for some shipping container in the woods. It explains why their final actions would seem utterly irrational to everyone in the outside world. In the grip of a shared delusion, did they flee their truck in a panic? Were they convinced that they were being pursued by the very spirits or demons that they were fleeing from, leaving the home for? And then in that fleeing from the truck, did they at that time get lost and die of exposure? Did their paranoia escalate into a violent confrontation between the two of them? Or did their erratic delusional behavior lead them into a fatal encounter with a very real person in the woods, someone who was not a demon, but was no less dangerous? The shared psychosis, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, is kind of like the engine here. It's the psychological force that that caused them to drive off the map of rational behavior and deep into the Sans Bois Mountains, where they met that end. And that is the thing that we may never truly understand. The mystery of the Jamison family is it's not a puzzle with a missing piece. It's a puzzle where every piece fits with another piece in a way that really just kind of starts to create an impossible picture. Right? The untouched cash argues against murder, but the missing gun and the hole in the skull suggest it, right? The hate letter points to this family implosion, but their love for their daughter makes that seem completely, utterly unthinkable. Again, as I said, this case does remain open but cold. And there is just this file now full of contradictions, forever suspended in all of this ambiguity. What we can be sure of is that a family collapsing under the weight of pain, illness, and fear got into their truck on that day, October 8th, and they drove into the mountains seeking some sort of an escape, which to me is just incredibly fucking sad. It's incredibly sad. They were fleeing demons, both real and maybe imagined, but to them, it was so real. It was so real. And in that wilderness that they fled to, they did not find the sanctuary that they were seeking. They found their grave. The wind still whispers through those trees on Red Oak Mountain. The soil still holds all of those secrets, and the ghosts of Bobby, Sherilynn, and little Madyson Jamison still haunt the edges of this unsettling American mystery. Their silent screams have been forever lost in those vast and unending woods. If you have any information about this case, you are urged to contact the Latimer County Sheriff's Office at 918-465-2161. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today so that I could tell you this story, talk about this case. It's always a pleasure for me. This is my favorite thing to do. And I love you guys for being here with me while I do it. As always, if you enjoyed the video or if you enjoy my content, please give the video a like. Go ahead and hit subscribe. I'm here with you as often as I possibly can be. And until I see you guys again next time, please stay safe. Keep asking questions and keep unraveling. Love you.